Hello and welcome to Gadget Joe, and today we're taking a look at the second part of a two-part series of the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX AIO. In the previous video, which is last week's video, which I'll link down in the description if you haven't already seen that, we looked at the unboxing of the AIO that was sent over by Be Quiet. That is of course for Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX. If you haven't seen last week's video, basically we took everything out of the box. I showed you everything that you get inside the box, including the fans, the USB hub, the actual AIO itself, the mounting hardware, and also the extra bottle of added coolant, which I thought was a really nice touch. So rather than doing what I normally do and have everything in one video, I had a few issues that meant that I needed to do this over two videos. So today's video is basically the benchmark, testing and results video. Installing the AIO is super simple. All you need to do is basically take away your existing cooler if you already have one. If you have a brand new motherboard and you want them to install, then obviously there's instructions on how to do so, but it is super simple. If you have an AMD setup, you will find this much easier than if you were to have an Intel setup. The Intel setup requires more of a procedure, more of a construction when it comes to mounting the cooler. It's not difficult, but it's just going to be a bit more simple with AMD. Installing the AIO is super simple. All you need to do is basically take away your existing cooler if you already have one. If you have a brand new motherboard and you want them to install, then obviously there's instructions on how to do so, but it is super simple. If you have an AMD setup, you will find this much easier than if you were to have an Intel setup. The Intel setup requires more of a procedure, more of a construction when it comes to mounting the cooler. It's not difficult, but it's just going to be a bit more simple with AMD. With AMD it is simply a few screws and then a couple of screws to mount it into place and you're good to go. Obviously once you've got it all into place, what you're going to need to do is decide where you're wanting the AIO to go. Obviously on my system, as you can see here, it's mounted to the back panel of the case. Not all cases are going to be able to do that. Some cases are going to be quite restrictive. Some of them you will have to put on the front, on the top, or even the bottom. So before you go and install everything, you might want to sit back and just hold the unit and try and work out exactly where it's going to go and allow for the tubing length to make a decision on that as well, because you don't want to be having any extra tension on that tubing when you've got it all installed. It's also worth noting that before you put it all in, it's worth installing the fans to the radiator outside of the case before you install it. Now whilst you can install everything when it's all in, that's not saying that you can't do that. It's just going to make it a lot easier for you in the long run. When it comes to applying the thermal paste, there's no real wrong way of doing it. A lot of people will argue that you've got to do the dot method, you've got to do the P method, you've got to do the cross method, you've got to paste it on there, you've got to butter it like you would toast. It doesn't really matter, as long as you've got adequate coverage on there, it's fine. I like to do the cross method, and then what you need to do is once you've got your preferred method of thermal paste application, you line up the CPU block with the processor in the correct orientation to the mounts on your motherboard. So once you've got that lined up, all you need to do is then take the two screws for the AMD setup, take the two screws, line them up with the mounts, the brackets that's already been installed previously, and then slowly but surely place it on top of a processor. Now again, I'm not telling you to suck eggs, but you need to be careful with this. Put it on nice and evenly, and when it comes to screwing it into place, do a couple of turns on one screw, a couple of turns on the next screw, and then keep alternating until it is hand tight. This would basically allow for a properly even spread, but also it's not going to cause any uneven tension on the processor. If you then tighten everything on one side and then do the other side, it could potentially cause some damage. Once you've then got that into place, you're ready to plug your USB hub into position. The USB hub comes with a foam pad with an adhesive pad on it so that you can stick it to the back of the motherboard tray on the case. You could alternatively tie it into place with some zip ties, or you can screw it into place if you get it in the right place. My case actually had a nice space at the top that I was able to put it in, which actually worked out quite well for me, because the reason that this video is a little bit late is I made a schoolboy error of trying to plug everything in. I got everything into place, all the fans were wired up, the pump was wired up, the CPU block was wired up, everything was in place, PWM controller was again in place on the motherboard. Then it came to the point of plugging in the ARGB controller lead, and that's when I realised that the motherboard I have is an ASUS Prime A320M, a motherboard that does not in fact have an RGB or an ARGB header. So obviously I had a bit of an issue. I could do the review, and I actually did the review of the AIO, basically showing the cooling aspects of it, but it sort of took away from the whole point of the video. It is marketed as a ARGB AIO. You can get a non-RGB unit, but that's not this. So I basically ordered myself an ARGB controller from Amazon. It was a couple of quid, it arrived the next day, and I'm all good to go. I'll throw over while I'm talking now some of the lighting modes that you can see from here. Obviously the fans have 18 LEDs built into them. It looks fantastic. The CPU block as well also has some lighting which matches, and it all sort of sinks in really nicely. So if you don't have a motherboard, maybe a modern motherboard, or a motherboard that has a RGB or ARGB header, don't worry, you can simply order a ARGB controller from Amazon or anywhere like that, or any of your local stores, so that you're not restricted on what motherboard you use. Now obviously the advantage of having a motherboard with that on is that you can control it from software on your computer, rather than having to reach around the back and pressing it through a button. I know obviously you can get some with controllers, but having it on your computer is going to be more ideal, because then you can sync everything up just from sitting at your desk. Now let's get to the testing of the PureLoop AIO and find out exactly how well it performed. These tests were performed using a Ryzen 5 2600 6-core 12-thread CPU on an ASUS Prime A320M with 16GB of RAM and an MSI 1070. All benchmarks were performed equally under the same conditions to get the most honest representations in each test. We tested the AMD stock Wraith Stealth Air Cooler, a Jonsbo CR1200E, a 120mm tower cooler, a Be Quiet Dark Rock 4 120mm tower cooler, a Cooler Master Master Liquid Light 240mm AIO, and of course the Be Quiet PureLoop 2 FX AIO. The first test was simply running at idle for 30 minutes with no activity, and as you can see, the Wraith and Jonsbo performed amicably at the top 30s at their lowest and into the low 50 degrees at their highest. The Dark Rock 4 had a noticeable increase in performance by 4 degrees on both the low and highs. The AIOs, however, are in a different league, but the PureLoop picked the victory at a 19 low and 26 high compared to the Cooler Master's 23 low and 32 high. Next we tested whilst playing Fortnite for 30 minutes on high settings, a game that isn't particularly intensive graphically but can certainly raise the temperature of your system. The results are very similar, a theme very common with all our testing. The Dark Rock performed the best out of the air coolers, and the PureLoop 2 picked the victory once again over the Cooler Master. For our next test I ran something a little more along the lines of my usual workflow and rendered a 10-minute 1080p video on Premiere Pro. The results were actually quite surprising this time round, with the Wraith and Jonsbo performing almost identically, the Dark Rock edging forward as expected. The Cooler Master actually outperformed the PureLoop 2 on the higher end by 2 degrees, but fell short on the lower end. For the final test I set to render a 10-minute 4K video, and this time the results were back to the same trend line, with the air coolers really feeling the stress this time, hitting highs of 67 on the Wraith and 57 on the Dark Rock. The Cooler Master performed well with a 32 low and a 55 high, but the PureLoop 2 grabs the victory once again with an impressive 26 low and a high of just 52. Throughout all of our testing, the Pure Loop 2 never once hit above 53 degrees and maintained a low temperature too. No doubt thanks to those high-speed PWM fans kicking in when needed. So, as you can see from the testing, the results are pretty evident to see. Would I recommend getting a AIO? Absolutely. It's not an expensive upgrade compared to a stock air cooler. It's going to add that extra little bit of flair to your system, and it's also a first step in an introduction to water cooling, which you can then venture in further down the line. Would I recommend this AIO over another AIO? Now, this one retails at about £120 in the UK. Obviously, the prices vary from wherever you pick it from, but I'll leave a link in the description to where you can get it for £120. Yes, I absolutely would recommend this AIO in particular because I'm a big fan of Be Quiet anyway. Their build quality is fantastic. Installation was super simple. That USB hub is fantastic. Just the little extra attention to details that you get, such as the additional coolant, the ability to drain and refill the AIO, and obviously the high-speed fans that are included, and also the ARGB fans, which can be controlled by a 3-pin ARGB controller for idiots like me. So absolutely yes, if you're looking for something to improve the performance of your system for not a lot of money, and you really want to improve the looks and aesthetic of your system too, it's a bit of a no-brainer. Now obviously you can get cheaper ones, but they don't often perform quite as well. A lot of the cheaper ones don't have the ARGB either. So with that said, if you're interested in getting your hands on one, again, like I've mentioned multiple times in this video, I will leave the link in the description below as to where you can get your hands on one. What did you think of the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX? What did you think of me being an idiot, not looking into what I should be basically knowing, and that's using the wrong motherboard? Let me know down in the comments, and that's pretty much it from me. Whilst you're down there, please click like, because it does help the channel grow, and it also lets the channel, YouTube sort of algorithms and stuff, I don't know exactly how it works, but just give me a like, and it'll help push the channel out there. Once you've done that, if you haven't already, click subscribe, and that's it for me for this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.